Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hewitt Shaw, the president of the board of directors of the City Club, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Again today at our Friday Forum, the City Club of Cleveland highlights an important and timely issue for our nation and for our community, presented by a nationally renowned expert. As part of topics ranging from international competitiveness to economic growth to community vitality to fiscal responsibility and to community safety, the education of our youth plays a central role. In that regard, I am delighted to present to you today Linda Darling-Hammond, the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education at Stanford University, where she has launched the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy and Education and the School Redesign Network, and has served as the faculty sponsor for the Stanford Teacher Education Program. She is a former president of the American Education Research Association and member of the National Academy of Education. Her research, teaching, and policy work focus on issues of school restructuring, teacher quality, and educational opportunity. From 1994 to 2001, she served as executive director of the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future, and a effort referred to as America's Future, What Matters Most, Teaching for America's Future, which led to sweeping policy changes affecting teaching and teacher education. In 2006, this report was named one of the most influential affecting U.S. education, and Professor Darling-Hammond was named one of the nation's 10 most influential people affecting education policy over the last decade. She recently served as the leader of President Barack Obama's education policy transition team. Professor Darling-Hammond is a native of Cleveland, Ohio, so we're happy to have her back here today. She received her BA. She received her BA magna cum laude from Yale University and her doctorate in education with highest distinction in urban education at Temple University. Please join me in welcoming to the Friday Forum podium today, Professor Linda Darling-Hammond.
Should be on. Okay. It is my hometown, and a lot has changed since I lived here, although not the weather in the winter. My kids teased me one time when I was telling stories about growing up in Cleveland, and my daughter said, I know, you walk to school in the snow up to your hips, uphill both ways, right? So, yep, that's right. That's how we did it. And not the tradition of the City Club, which has been alive for many years. But when I lived here, we had a pretty dead lake with dead fish kind of coming up onto the shore, and the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And that's all been cleaned up, and there's now a lake shore, and much has changed there. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and other, sites have come to Cleveland. And the economy has changed from factory work. When I was growing up here, you could drop out of high school if it didn't suit you, get a great job making high wages in the factories downtown, get a little house in East Cleveland or downtown or Parma or wherever, and raise a family and have a good life. And that manufacturing industry is now gone. In that way, those numbers of jobs not to return, and it's now a high-tech medical technology center and so on, and a commerce center. So the whole economy has changed, and the people who have succeeded and survived in this area are those who had the education to take advantage of the change in the economy. Back in the 1950s, about half of our jobs were manufacturing jobs, low-skilled manufacturing jobs in this country. It's probably more than that in Cleveland. But by 2000, the number of jobs that were low-skilled manufacturing had dropped down to about 20%. And so we've seen this enormous shift in the economy. And that has given us a lot of pressure to improve the education system, because we now have to educate almost all kids to the level that we used to cream off a small number, put them in gifted and talented programs or advanced placement programs or whatever, and they would be the ones who would become the knowledge workers. But knowledge work is now 70% of the economy and growing all of the time. So we have to have schools that can prepare virtually everyone for what we once used to prepare only a very few. And so we've seen these waves of reform. 1983, a nation at risk, a rising tide of mediocrity, blah, blah. 1989, goals 2000, the governors, the president got together. The White House said we want to be first in the world in math and science by the year 2000. Remember that statistic, we'll come back to it. 1994, there was a report called The Gathering Storm, and there's been a lot of energy around school reform. But the question we have to ask ourselves is it the right kind of reform? And is it the reform that will get us to the goals that we seek? And while we have been trying to adjust to this new world, this changing economy, et cetera, other nations have been nipping at our heels and now beginning, in some cases, to surpass us. And I was looking at this wonderful book that I was just given about the City Club, America's Soapbox. And back in March of 1958, Lawrence Sturthick, who was the Commissioner of Education at HEW, had this to say in this building. He said, historically, Americans were willing to sacrifice anything to provide educational opportunities for their children. Unfortunately, through the years, this kind of support and concern has been worn away. The power and privilege of education we have come to take too much for granted. We now find the Russians taking a page out of the American history book and applying unprecedented vigor and resources to their educational system. It is their plan to beat us in the classroom. Well, it wasn't the Russians who ended up beating us in the classroom, but that description would fit for China today. They're putting hundreds of billions of yen into a system to train up the best trained teaching force in the world, to radically upgrade the quality of their schools, which is quite uneven across the country. We hear about Hong Kong and Shanghai, but they don't represent the rest of China. But China is making those investments. It was a result of that concern that in the post-Sputnik years, the federal government put all kinds of money into improving math and science education. I benefited from that coming through schools in Cleveland. Many of you may have as well. Put money into teacher training. Many of us came into the profession over the 60s and 70s, fully paid on the National Defense Student Loan Act and a variety of other things. Put resources into equalizing opportunity through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And by the 1970s, we were #1 in the world, undisputed, in education, on every indicator. And we had made tremendous progress towards equity. In 1975, the proportion of white, black, and Hispanic students going to college was exactly equal because of the investments that had been made, both in quality and in equity, and in access to our public higher education systems through the Pell Grants and other federal financial aid. So that was 1970s. However, we are now not #1. In high school attainment, where we were #1, the top-ranking nation now is South Korea. They're graduating about 95% of kids, as are a number of other countries. We've been stuck at about 70 to 75% graduation rate for the last 40 years. We just haven't budged very much. Our college participation rate was always #1. It's now 17th in the world and dropping about 2 slots per year. Why? Because the Pell Grants and other federal financial aid have slipped relative to the cost of education. And kids who could get into college can't afford to go. Whereas many countries that are sort of the education tigers, if you will, the top-ranked nations on tests like PISA are Singapore, South Korea, Finland. Also Canada does very well, New Zealand, and some others. They pay for college for virtually all of the people who get in. So in South Korea, 95% graduate from high school, about 80% go on to fully paid college and technical schools. About 60% graduate with what we would consider a college degree as opposed to a polytechnic. So they're just making those intense investments. On the international assessments, which come out periodically, PISA is the one that people have paid a lot of attention to, where we were supposed to be first in the world in math and science. We were 21st in science and 27th in math in the last go-round, so the goals didn't get us there. And we were 12th in reading. We do a little better on another assessment called the TIMS, where we scored in the top 10 in math and reading. But where are we number one? We're number one in prison enrollment. We have the largest inmate population numerically and proportionately of any country in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's inmates. We have more people in prison than China has in prison, given the relative difference in size. And what that has done is it has sucked up what is the investment that should be being made in education. So in many states, California is one, Ohio's close behind. We now spend more on the correction system than we do on public higher education. We used to spend about 2% of our budget on corrections, about 11% on public higher education. That's reversed. Prisons are 12%, public higher education is 7%. We can't send our own kids to college. And yet we're in a world where our capacity to educate our kids for college and career-ready jobs is what's going to determine our nation's future. And in California, we won't spend $10,000 on a child to educate them, but we'll spend $50,000 a year on that same child 10 years later when he doesn't graduate and he's in the school-to-prison pipeline. And that, again, is being replicated across the country. So we've got to really rethink our national plan, our strategy, our priorities, and make investments in a way that works. The prison population is about 80% of inmates are high school dropouts. So that 30% that we haven't budged is costing us in a way that we are not able to pay for my Social Security, which I'm now getting worried about. I don't know about you. And health care. You know, I'm at that age. I want everyone to come up, get a good paying job, pay taxes to support my welfare. I don't want to have a system where they end up you know, having to cost the taxpayer. We need to educate all kids, even if we didn't do it for moral and ethical purposes, which is where we should be starting. We should do it for our own self-interest, because our nation cannot survive if we don't make investments in that way. Most inmates are functionally illiterate. So this is an education issue as much as it is anything else. So what happened with our education system? Is it the quality of our schools? Well, not completely. That's not the entire problem. If you look at those PISA results I mentioned, by poverty levels, if you look at schools that serve less than 10% of kids in poverty, we're number one in the world in reading. Even schools with up to 25% of kids in poverty, we're number 3 in the world in reading. But in our growing number of schools where 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of kids live in poverty, we're among the lowest achieving in the world. It's really an equity question. And what has happened in our country is that we have many, many excellent schools. Other countries still come here to study our educational innovations. I host visitors from Singapore all the time. So we come here to see what you're doing, all the good work you're doing. We go back home and we scale it up. We scale it up for everyone. But we've got a number of issues going on. One is a tremendous increase in childhood poverty. None of the high-achieving nations in the world has more than 10% of children living in poverty, but our poverty rate for children is 1 in 4. So we have by far the highest childhood poverty rate of any country in the developed world. And we've resegregated schools. So we have a growing number of schools that are what I think of as apartheid schools, that are high poverty, highly segregated schools, which also get less money because we have a system where funding is not equitably distributed across schools. And so we have more money spent on the education of affluent students than low-income students. We have a growing number of students in poverty. And then you get this big divide in the achievement gap that we talk about constantly. Third thing has been the elimination of federal supports. In the 1980s, the federal budget for education was cut in half, and most of that came out of funding for urban schools, for magnet schools, for desegregation, for teacher training, for math and science programs. That gave me a great education when I was coming through in this area in the 1950s and 60s, those programs. I remember my new math book. I remember the federally funded science program that I got. And they were great, and they sent me to Yale University, and I was able to do well there, coming out of a public school background. Fourth, we've been neglecting our teaching force. One of the things you'll see in high-achieving countries is they make huge investments in the quality of teachers. You will go to a preparation program that is high quality, completely free, and earn a salary or a stipend while you get trained. You will earn a salary that is commensurate with other professions. In Singapore, it will be the equivalent of an entering doctor in government service, an entering teacher. It will be about the same. Here, we have almost no support for training teachers, and then we let them come into a profession where they earn 60% of other college graduates with a mountain of debt. It's not a recipe for attracting and keeping the best and the brightest. The fifth thing that's been an issue is that we have invested in a form of testing that is very narrow. We're the only country among the highly developed countries that tests children every year and then uses multiple choice tests. Assessments in other countries are fewer, and they are open-ended essay examinations and problem sets and increasingly projects like science investigations that are scored as part of the accountability system. So while our kids are memorizing facts and bubbling in, kids in Singapore are designing science investigations, conducting their own experiments, writing up the results like little science journal articles, and becoming the technology innovators of tomorrow. We set goals in 1989, but we did not put in place a plan that could achieve that set of goals. So our issue now is what's the set of reforms that will get us to the goals that we need to meet. And so let's ask, what do high-performing nations do? I've given a few little clues, and I'll quickly tell you 5 things looking across the world. I've been studying what high-performing nations are doing. First thing they do is they take good care of children. They provide housing, they provide health care uniformly, preschool, early childhood education, free of charge, universally available. And that's a particular issue for us because we don't do that in most of our states. And kids who have less access to preschool are the ones who are also getting less educational opportunity at home. If you look at the achievement gap between richer and poorer 9th graders, a third of that was present before kindergarten. And high-quality preschool programs can narrow that gap considerably when they're put in place. But if we don't choose that achievement, close that achievement gap, it's hard to catch up. The other part of that gap, the other 2/3 of that difference, is attributable to summer learning loss. More affluent kids gain achievement during the summer because they're getting wonderful enrichment opportunities, and you can imagine and know what those are. And when low-income kids are not getting those opportunities, again, those programs were cut a couple of decades ago, they're losing achievement. So between June and September, some kids are getting smarter and other kids are losing ground. And that's, those 2 things are a big part of closing the achievement gap. Second, they fund schools equitably. All schools get the same amount of money. They may give more money to schools that have new immigrant students. If you were in Singapore, 80% of the kids live in public housing. Looks kind of like the Bronx co-ops. Anybody here from New York? Those big cement buildings, concrete, 50 stories high. They're very spare and not at all, well-heeled, clean and spare. But kids will come down out of the co-ops into the school at the bottom of what they call the housing estate. And that school, regardless of their background and their income, will be a magnificent, beautiful school. You will walk into a grand piano in the entryway, artwork around all the walls, well-trained teachers in every classroom, computers on the desk, textbooks, the latest instructional materials, kids involved there. Their whole thing is to get away from rote learning and innovate. So you'll go through a school, they'll have something called an innovation walk. and you see all the inventions that kids have developed, the businesses that they're growing. They have little stalls where the kids can create their own little economy and run their businesses, but that's available to everyone. So their achievement is not only high, but it's very narrow, even though they have many minority and low-income communities within the country. Third, they invest in teachers in the ways that I've described, including giving them a lot of time and support when they're in service to continue to learn. Fourth, they focus on meaningful learning goals. Most countries have overhauled their goals, their national curriculum. They're focused on 21st century skills, which include communication and teamwork and collaboration, as well as inquiry and research and investigation and writing and so on. And they use these kinds of performance assessments I described. And fifth, they are growing higher education. You know, in Singapore, for example, there are partnerships with MIT and Yale and all other top-tier American colleges coming into Singapore. They're not only growing their own universities in number, but they're also bringing American universities there. What they're not doing, and we see this happening in the United States now, is number one, they're not disinvesting in schools. While we see budget cuts, $1.8 billion in Ohio, but from the last biennium to the next one for schools, they're pouring resources in because they understand that education is what's going to grow the economy. Second, they're not bashing teachers. They respect teachers. They speak highly of teachers. In Korea, they'll say, don't even step on the shadow of a teacher. In Singapore, the president and the prime minister will say, teachers are the heartbeat of our nation because our nation depends on our education system. They pay them well, they treat them well, they keep them for an entire career. And third, they're not managing schools primarily by test scores. They take accountability seriously. They have assessments, and they use them for information, but they understand that they don't want to narrow the curriculum. They want to broaden it to the 21st century skills that we have to master. So let's look at our reform agenda in relation to the strategies pursued by the highest achieving nations. And very quickly, there is some overlap, but not as much as we might hope. Preschool is still not on the agenda in most of our states, but in the states that have put it there, like Oklahoma, which has done universal preschool, you see huge reductions in the achievement gap and gains overall in early learning in the schools. And the benefits, you know, for every $1 invested in preschool, you get about $7 to $10 back in net benefits because fewer kids fail grades and get retained, fewer go into special education, fewer drop out, fewer go into the prison system, more get jobs, more get good jobs that pay higher taxes. Finance reform is something that we're fighting state by state. There are 44 states right now with school finance lawsuits. Ohio has been one of them. You've had a recurring set of lawsuits to try to reduce the gap. The highest spending districts here spend 3 times as much as the lowest spending districts in the state. But it is still a fight. Almost every state has its state school finance lawsuit and its state calendar and its state bird. You know, it's like they're all, we all have these things going on. This is a tough one for us because historically, the reason we have these inequalities came from a good place. We valued education. We said every town, when you create a town, you've got to create a school. And you got to fund that school. And the teachers would live in somebody's house and, you know, they do whatever they could. But the towns have different revenue bases, different resource bases, and we never came back around when education became so important to say, how are we going to do this equally? So it came from a good place. It's part of our tradition, but it's now outmoded because every other high-achieving country in the world spends money equitably on schools. On teachers, we have less support for training and development in many places, and more focus on evaluation. Some of that focus is beneficial. Some of it is likely to be less so. What do we need? We need to fix evaluation systems. We've got to have good standards, frequent feedback, good training for evaluators. Ohio created one of the best teacher evaluation systems in the country, the peer assistance and review programs that some cities here have created. And they've spread. We now have that statewide in California. We got that from Ohio. And it's a good way to be sure people get mentoring and assistance. And if they don't improve, that they get removed within a reasonable period of time quickly and expeditiously. But we're also going into some difficult waters. One of the reforms that is on the table is the use of test scores to evaluate teachers using something called value-added metrics, methodologies. I'm a researcher who was very interested and enthusiastic about value-added a few years ago, who has, among many, many other researchers, found that it has a lot more difficulties and problems than we realized. So the National Research Council has recently come out to say value-added should not be used as a tool to make decisions about teachers because it's very unstable, it's unreliable. Turns out that it's biased, that the metrics bounce around, and they're tightly tied, even though the statistics try to control for it, they're tightly tied to the composition of the student body. And we have problems with our state tests because they're designed only to measure the grade level. So if you have kids above or below the grade level, they're not measuring their gains very well. So just to give you an example of a story about this, there's a great teacher in New York State where they've already implemented the system that Ohio is just getting ready to tackle. And she taught 7th and 8th grade math. She had her 7th graders at the 98th percentile on the state tests, about as good as it gets. She had the same kids in 8th grade. To get a good value-added score, she would have had to have gotten them further advanced than other teachers. So she would have had to have gotten above 100%. Hard to do. And so in 8th grade, she was teaching them the 10th grade curriculum and the Regents test in 10th grade. All of them, 8th graders, took that 10th grade test and passed it. A third of them got perfect scores. But on the value-added metric, she was the worst performing teacher. She got a 0 because she couldn't show growth that was greater than that of other teachers because the kids were already at the top and she was teaching them another curriculum. And they wouldn't look at those test scores because they only wanted to use that one measure. Her principal said, "I'd really like to keep you. The parents love you. The kids love you. But the rules are that if you get an ineffective on this measure, regardless of anything else, we can't automatically give you tenure. I'll fight for you." But the teacher said, "Forget about it. I'm out of here." She went off and got a PhD in math. Now, in New York, they found that this happens to almost all the teachers in gifted and talented programs. It also happens to teachers who have new English learners and special education kids. In Houston, they're finding that kids don't want to take on the students with greater needs, and so on. So that's a territory where the reform has got to be right. We got to figure out how to look at learning, which we should do, in the way that is productive for getting kids to learn and teachers to be supported. Finally, standards, curriculum, and testing. We do have Common Core state standards now, kind of like the model, the national curriculum that many other countries have, or state curriculum. That's promising. If we can do assessment right, if we can have assessments that really measure thinking skills, writing skills, performance skills, move beyond the bubble to assessments that are comparable with those elsewhere in the world, we could really make some headway with that reform. So the final thing I'll say is that there are other areas where the way we do reform will make a big difference. Another area of reform is charter schools. There have been some examples of great innovations in charters. I actually happen to have co-founded a charter school in California. Stanford runs a school in East Palo Alto, which is a low-income community, where we've transformed the outcomes, and we've got 90% of kids graduating and 90% going to college, coming in with very low skills because we've redesigned the school. But we've also seen that the charter world is a mixed bag, just like public schools are, and that in Ohio you've had some of the more major problems with for-profit charters that don't produce outcomes and take money from the public purse, and concerns about whether kids who have great levels of need are going to be accepted and kept in all schools. So this is an area where we could make progress if we think about things thoughtfully, or we could regress if we don't manage the reform as carefully as we might. There are places where reforms have been successful. And I'll just tell one story, and that is the case of New Jersey, because I think it's a useful case for Ohio. New Jersey, I always thought of as that strip of I-95 between New York and Philadelphia, because those are the two places I lived in. You don't think of it as an educational, hotbed. And they had 30 years of school funding reform efforts. I was a student teacher in Camden, New Jersey. There were no books in the book room. There was no support for the schools in the high minority, low-income schools. They spent half as much as the wealthier, more advantaged school districts. It was litigated and litigated, 9 court cases, a little bit like Ohio. Finally, in 1998, Christy Todd Whitman, Republican governor, stepped up, put the money in that the courts asked her to put in to create parity funding in New Jersey, put in preschool for low-income kids, put in teacher development supports to train teachers around literacy and mathematics, and a variety of other things, some whole school reform models. Jim Comer's work was very prominent there. And within 10 years, New Jersey became one of the highest achieving states in the nation. It's #1 right now in writing. It's in the top 5 on everything. It has 45% students of color. More than a third of the kids live in poverty. And the achievement gap was cut in half. So when you think about reform with an eye on the prize and think about it systemically and at scale, you can turn this kind of situation around relatively quickly. But it takes that kind of drive and purpose. So I will leave you with these thoughts about the reform agenda. It's important for us to pick our reforms wisely, to then pursue them wholeheartedly at scale, and to ensure that we're putting first and foremost preserving the heartbeat of our democracy, which is our public education system. Thank you. Did I sit down? Okay. I'm going to take that water with me.
Sure. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Linda Darling-Hammond, the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education at Stanford University. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Please formulate your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of our many radio broadcast stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIC PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Closed captioning of our programs is made possible by the Nordson Corporation. We welcome today guests at tables hosted by Cleveland Heights University Heights Schools, the Cleveland Teachers Union, the College Now Greater Cleveland, the Cuyahoga Community College, Forest City, and the Greater Cleveland School Superintendents Association. Today we also welcome students from the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. Student participation in today's program is made possible by the Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. Would the students please rise to be recognized? Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Program Director Carrie Miller and Development Associate Nancy Og. May we have the first question, please?
First, I'd like to say I'm thrilled you're here. I just need to say that. In your book, The Flat World in Education, in reference to violence in schools, you made the following statement: reflexive responses to violence in schools often lead to investments in metal detectors and security guards rather than more personalized environments with effective human touch points for youth. Could you please explain human touch points for youth?
Sure. let me talk for a minute about high schools, which in our country are often quite large. We inherited them from the industrial model of the 1920s, and sometimes they're 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. In New York and LA, 5,000 kids in a building, where it's very hard to be well known, where kids bounce around every 45 or 50 minutes to another teacher. The teachers have 150 or 180 kids. And you look at that kind of environment where there's a high level of anonymity for a lot of kids. Some kids get a small school experience because they're the top tier and they're well known, and a lot of kids struggle. And in those kind of environments, quite often violence erupts a lot because there aren't enough human touch points. If a kid has had an experience, that is distressing to them, and they don't have anybody who can grab a hold of them or whatever, it can often erupt in behavior issues and so on. And we end up, in a lot of cases, bringing in metal detectors and making them more like prisons and putting on bars and all the rest of it, and bringing in police officers. And then what we find is that you can clamp down, but the level of learning and developmental behavior doesn't necessarily increase. Alternatively, you can do what a lot of schools have done. Many of the schools I worked with in New York, others I've worked with in California, there are some of them here. Recreate the school, rethink what school is about, create a small learning community or environment, either within a big building or in its own, 300, 400 kids, more like the size of many private schools. Be sure that all kids are known, all parents and family members are known. Give every kid an advisor who will be in touch with the home and with the child, and make sure that they're getting those touch points. And what happens immediately when you do that is that violent behavior and incidences go way down. We've got much experience with this because kids will respond to being known and being taught and being enabled and helped to grow and learn and develop. And you put in those schools social and emotional learning opportunities in the advisory where kids are learning how to be responsible and interact productively and so on. And you can transform very quickly. I've seen this many times, a graffiti-ridden, violence-prone building with low graduation rates to a place where kids are succeeding, where it's safe, where they're taking responsibility for themselves and for their community, and where the graduation rates go way up because kids feel like they're being helped to get through school.
Hi. You mentioned summer breaks being a time that could have negative cognitive growth on students. Do you foresee schools starting the cycle program that they have in South Carolina, where it's 6 weeks on and 2 weeks off throughout the whole year? Do you see that being a better option for schools, or something that the states might start doing?
Well, it might be that could be helpful. The longer break does give more opportunity for attrition, but we've had a lot of people trying to tackle the school calendar in the United States. Maybe some of you are in this room, and you might have been taller then than you are now. It's a tough issue. So I think that might be one way, and there may be communities where you could spread out the learning in a different way. And other countries, it's interesting, a lot of people think that other countries have more school time than we do. They have more school days, but we have more instructional hours than almost any other country in the world. But we cram them in, and we then have this long summer break. And they tend to spread them out. And they may have shorter days, but they spread them more over the calendar. So I think there's value in that. But the alternative, if we can't do that, is to get rich summer programs in place for all kids. And again, this was something that was federally funded in the 60s and 70s. Virtually any young person could get a summer camp or educational experience, summer school experience, or a summer job, which is also learning, and does actually continue to build cognitive skills in those cases. So you could do it in a variety of ways, and I think that's another option, is to be sure that all kids are getting the rich learning experiences that right now some kids get.
Hello, my name is Oget Shanyuku, and I attend the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. For those who aren't familiar with the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine, it's one of the higher performance schools in Cleveland. And we are proud to say that one of our previous students attends Stanford University. Yes. And my question for you is...
What's his or her name, do you know?
Wesley Grainer, yeah.
I'll find him.
Yeah, he's a freshman. Okay, and my question for you is that it appears that in many public schools, students are taught what they'll be tested on. How can Cleveland and other schools reconstruct the new form of assessment?
Great question, because I think that's really true. We have, one of our reform ideologies or strategies has been driving reform through testing. And, you know, then saying if you have certain test score goals and so on. So when you have that kind of a reform theory, you better have the right kind of assessments, right? Because people are going to teach to that when accountability and stakes are attached to it. So we have a long way to go in that regard. One piece of it is that there are now 2 consortia of states, multi-state consortia, that are trying to develop assessments for the Common Core standards in English language, arts, and math. Ohio belongs to a consortium called PARC, and there are other states in that. And one thing that needs to happen is that consortium needs to be encouraged to have as much writing and inquiry and experimentation and thoughtfulness on those assessments as possible. Secondly, Ohio as a state and Cleveland as a city can think about what else they're going to do in terms of assessments. I just spent some time with folks in New Hampshire, and there are some other folks in New York who are doing this, where they're developing graduation portfolios. And some schools have been doing this for a long time, where in order to graduate, you do a science investigation, and you defend it to like a dissertation committee. You do a social science research paper. You do a literary analysis. You do a mathematical model, and something in the arts that demonstrates proficiency in the arts. All of those things have to be done and revised as projects with your teachers to a portfolio level that meets a standard and defended to a committee of people from inside and outside the school, explained, answer questions about it. When students graduate with those graduation portfolios, we have studies that show they succeed in college at much higher rates. Generally across the country, about 40 to 50% of kids who go into college actually come out with a degree. And in the schools that are using this kind of strategy, even though they are often low-income schools and kids have to pull together a lot of resources for the tuition and so on, 80% tend to get through college. And when you ask them what got you through college, they say it was the portfolio. As one girl said, she said, the portfolio sticks in your brain better. You know, when you've done that kind of work, that's what professors want you to be able to do. I'll tell you, the conversation among professors is not how did kids do bubbling in on a multiple choice test. It's can they write, can they research, can they inquire, can they take feedback and use it productively. So that's what you want schools and the state to be encouraging.
One of the areas of focus that, in the back here, one of the areas of focus you talked about was the importance of investing in teachers. I wondered if you'd give us your thoughts on, first of all, the best way to prepare young people to be teachers, and then secondly, professional development for more experienced teachers. What's the most effective way to handle that? Thanks.
Well, with respect to preparing teachers in the first place, first you have to be sure that they're getting a strong content background in the subjects that they're going to teach. And ideally, that might be integrated with training around how to teach pedagogically. What's the best way to teach that so that students will understand it? In Finland, they have a model which is like a model that we also have in some places in the United States, which is a 5-year teacher education process. There they do the 3 years of content training and then 2 years of a master's degree in education where you learn to teach that content. We have some 5-year models here in a number of universities where you can learn content and pedagogy. You get a full year of training under the wing of an expert teacher in a school, like a professional development school or a teaching school, like a teaching hospital in medicine, where they're set up to make sure that you learn the right things about teaching. And you put theory into action, and you're learning theory and putting it into action at the same time with the help of great teachers who bring that expertise. Ideally, you would also be doing research during that time. In Finland, you get admitted to teacher education. It's very competitive. Only 1 in 10 applicants can get in elementary school teaching. You have to read research articles and answer them before you, as part of your admission process. Then you use research, and then you do a thesis where you do research on teaching as part of your degree. What does that do? It creates a diagnostician. It means that you're trained like a doctor to understand how to put knowledge and research and theory into practice and to do your own theory building and your own research. Ideally, that's what all of our programs would look like. Right now, probably in the United States, 20% of programs look like that. But some states are making, investments in, building the capacity for all schools of education to have all of those components and to have that kind of teaching hospital, strategy at the same time. Once we get people in, they need good mentoring from expert mentors in the first year or two of teaching. Ohio has that plan on the books, and some districts have very good programs. And then they need professional learning that is sustained, linked to the content, linked to the kids, linked to coaching and modeling, where you get to really learn something, try it out, get help, implementing it from a coach or a mentor, and continue to develop that set of practices. And we know that when that's in place, it has a very large effect on student achievement.
My question, first, we're very privileged to have such a renowned expert in policy here. I have a three-part question. First, what pleased you about what the Obama administration was able to accomplish in education? What disappointed you? And what is it that you hope they get accomplished in the next 4 years?
Oh, boy. Thank you, Steve. What I was pleased about when we were doing the transition team, and I was part of that, that kind of is the process from November till January, till inauguration is when you do the transition work. One of the things we put together was the ARRA, the package of investments in education that came as part of the investments that we were able to get passed in that first part of the Congress. And we got more than $100 million into schools, $100 billion, sorry, into schools that really helped prevent teachers getting, wholesale fired and allowed schools to start to make investments in a variety of places. Now we're, experiencing both the loss of that and the continued downturn in the economy, and that's been much more challenging in the last couple of years. But I was pleased about that. I was pleased that he immediately got to work on the higher education front in terms of getting Pell Grants back on track to continue to climb again, because we need to have kids who have earned their way into college be supported to be able to go. When I went to college, if you could get in, between the college investments and the federal investments, you could get that education. I went to Yale, completely on a package of Yale and federal subsidies because my family couldn't have afforded to send me. That's no longer the case. So we need to have that. Kids who, we've got to build up. We've got to get from 38% college graduates to a place that's competitive with other countries, 60%. In Europe, it's 50% in almost every country. In parts of Asia, it's 60% now. So that's one that I was very pleased about. I was disappointed that we did not make headway on preschool because had we taken the $5 billion that was spent on Race to the Top and put it into high-quality preschool programs in every state and built that infrastructure, we could have counted on quite a significant closing of the achievement gap. And that is on the agenda for the beginning of this administration, and I'm very pleased about that. So I think, we'll see some things that couldn't move before moving now. And I think that it's been useful to get some of the reform conversations on the table, including we need to do a better job of dealing with low-performing schools, improving evaluation of teachers. But I think that we have had not enough investment and conversation about what the research and knowledge base tells us about how to do some of those things well and what might be false starts or, deflections from getting the goals accomplished. So I hope that the self-corrective in the second term will be to start getting on track the strategies that we have strong evidence about in terms of their ability to work for us. 'Cause we don't have a lot of time to make mistakes.
Hello, I'm fascinated by Mary Kennedy's research that she wrote a book called Inside Teaching. And what she said was one of the greatest impediments to school reform is teachers need to control the thinking in their classroom. So cooperative learning, turning the classroom into more of a cognitive organism is very difficult. And I think we've given them in education schools the notion that when you're not talking, when you're not telling, you're not teaching. And so do the more facilitative, type learning, group work, cooperative learning is, I think, what great teachers do. They give kids feedback, and they know what kids are doing. Do you agree with that, or is there a way, maybe my question is more about how do we convince teachers to let go a little bit of control so that they can turn their classrooms into cognitive organisms? Because I think it's never been a harder time to be a teacher, and we're giving them a lot of mixed messages.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, part of the problem is not just teachers, it's what the environment. I mean, for every teacher who may not yet be ready to do that because they've been trained to do it or supported to do it, there are teachers who want to do it, but they're prevented by other, edicts from their central office or their administration or the pressures of the test or whatever. So I don't think that it's as simple as saying there's one source of that problem. I think there are multiple sources of that problem. A lot of schools that train teachers, like Stanford, we have a whole course in how to teach. It's called Teaching in Heterogeneous Classrooms. The whole course is on cooperative learning in heterogeneous classes based on research that we know allows the management of that pedagogy to result in achievement for all kids, including English learners and others. There's nothing more frustrating than badly implemented group work. How many of you have had frustrating group work experiences? And so quite often what we have not done for teachers in this country is we have reforms, and we have whatever the reform is, we say, now do this. And we don't do what they do in medicine, which is if you have a new technique, you stand at the elbow of a surgeon who's using that technique, and you watch him, and you help him or her, and then you do it, and so on, and you gradually learn, and you get training in that technique. Nobody says, go in there. Let's mainstream special ed kids with no special ed training. Let's ask you to do cooperative. We're not going to train you for any of it, other than a 3-hour workshop after school, right? So it is hard to do it well. These are sophisticated practices. Teachers who get sophisticated training do it well and get results. So that's number one. We've got to be sure that all schools of education are preparing teachers to do this, that all in-service programs are well designed to support it, that principals understand it. There are a lot of people who will go into a classroom where cooperative learning is going on and they'll say, it's not quiet enough in here. It's too much talking. So we have models of teaching that get enforced in teacher evaluation systems and other things. So you also have teachers who are well trained for that practice who are not allowed to use it. So I think we've got to think about how do we get the whole system on the same page, where the standards of practice are tied to the way we evaluate teachers, are tied to the way we train teachers, are tied to the way we evaluate kids. If you want to see that, go to Singapore. Singapore is the size of Kentucky. So it's a state. It's the size of a state. And if we have states that are well organized to run coherently, they will do what Singapore does, which is all those things at the same time. And I think then I think we get all the parts of the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Professor Linda Darling-Hammond, the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education at Stanford University. Thank you, Professor Darling-Hammond. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.